Mr. Silas Croft, a man whose existence had hitherto been circumscribed by the rigid geometries of ledger lines and the immutable dictates of fiscal law, found himself, in the autumn of 1928, confronted by an anomaly that defied all rubric. A senior auditor for the nascent Bureau of Internal Revenue, Silas possessed a mind as meticulously ordered as the stacks of files within his Boston office. His world was one of predictable debits and credits, a sensible realm where every acquisition had a corresponding source and every expenditure traced back to a discernible income. It was precisely this foundational principle that the Whateley file from Dunwich, Massachusetts, threatened to dismantle. The initial report, a sparse thing forwarded from the Springfield district, spoke of a peculiar family, the Whateleys. Their tax declarations, spanning 2 decades, were as barren as the granite outcrops around their remote homestead. No reported income, no discernible trade, no conventional assets. Yet the scattered intelligence, whispers from booksellers in Arkham, invoices from livestock dealers in Vermont, painted a disconcertingly different tableau. Expenditures seemingly substantial for items utterly incongruous with destitution. Rare books of esoteric scholarship, many of them ancient grimoires penned in forgotten tongues, and a remarkable continuous acquisition of prime cattle, far exceeding the needs of a single reclusive farm. Silas, with a sigh that carried the faint scent of stale tobacco and institutional paper, packed his valise. Dunwich. The very name, when spoken by the clerks, seemed to carry a faint, unwholesome resonance, like a discordant note struck from an unhallowed instrument. It was a locale, notorious even amongst the rural backwaters of New England for its inbred squalor, its cretinous inhabitants, and the vaguely unsettling tales that clung to its hillsides like an ancient, persistent mildew. No rational man believed in such provincial superstitions, of course, but the professional curiosity that propelled Silas was now tinged with a faint, inexplicable apprehension. The journey itself was a descent into a landscape increasingly divorced from the ordered civility of metropolitan life. The paved roads gave way to crumbling asphalt, then to rutted dirt tracks that wound through increasingly desolate, spectral woods. The architecture became more ramshackle, the faces glimpsed through grimy window panes more vacant. Dunwich itself, when Silas finally arrived, was less a town and more an accretion of weathered leaning structures clustered around a central decaying common, presided over by the skeletal spire of a derelict church. A miasma of decay, of damp earth, and something indefinably putrescent hung heavy in the air. His first stop was the general store, a repository of provisions and local gossip. The proprietor, a stooped man with eyes like polished stones, offered little concrete information, only evasive shrugs and a profound disinclination to speak of the Whateleys. "They keep to themselves," he muttered, wiping down a counter with a rag. "Always have. Odd folk. Not much money, far as I know, but they buy queer things sometimes, foreign-like." Silas pressed, "And how do they pay for these queer things?" The proprietor hesitated, his gaze shifting to the dusty shelves. "Sometimes not like regular folk." The word was dropped like a pebble into a stagnant well, sending ripples of unease through the auditor. His subsequent investigation led him to the local records office, a dank, ill-lit room where ancient ledgers mouldered in their presses. The land titles for the Whateley property, high on Sentinel Hill, were convoluted, dating back to colonial patents granted to individuals long forgotten, punctuated by strange, nearly illegible marginalia. More illuminating were the accounts of the various booksellers and cattle dealers from whom the Whateleys had made their mysterious purchases. These ledgers, meticulously kept despite the exotic nature of their contents, confirmed the proprietor's oblique statement. Entries for payment received were often accompanied by curious annotations: gold coin, ancient mintage, unusual weight. One such entry from an Arkham antiquarian described a payment for a copy of the Occult des Ghouls, a forbidden tome Silas knew by reputation to be a profoundly disturbing work, as 23 pieces of yellow metal, quite large, with an unfamiliar device depicting a 9-angled star and a cephalopodon motif. The phrasing resonated with a peculiar chill in Silas's professional marrow. He had dealt with collectors of ancient numismatics, but these descriptions transcended mere rarity. They suggested an origin wholly outside the known canon of human civilization. Back in his temporary lodgings, a room above the Dunwich Inn, permeated by the smell of aged wood and an underlying indescribable mustiness, Silas meticulously transcribed these entries. The sheer volume of gold, transacted over 2 decades, suggested a source of extraordinary richness, utterly at odds with the reported poverty of the Whateleys. And the descriptions of the coins were too consistent, too specific. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a man stumbling upon a cipher, that he had found his lead. This was not mere tax evasion. This was an economic anomaly of a scale and nature that threatened to unravel the very fabric of his ordered world. The Whateleys were not simply buying rare books. They were paying for them with wealth that seemed to have poured from the very cracks of time. Armed with photostatic copies of the peculiar ledger entries and his growing sense of professional unease, Silas returned to Boston. His initial inquiries led him to the numismatic department of Miskatonic University, the venerable Arkham institution renowned for its arcane collection of forbidden lore. Dr. Armitage, the department head, a man whose dry intellect was rivaled only by his scholarly pallor, examined the crude sketches Silas had painstakingly copied from the bookseller's ledgers. Armitage's usual academic detachment quickly gave way to a palpable agitation. His spectacles slipped down his nose as he peered at the depictions of the 9-angled star and the cephalopodon motif. "Impossible," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Utterly, monstrously impossible." He fetched various tomes, heavy, leather-bound things, their pages brittle with age. He cross-referenced, consulted, and grew increasingly pale. "These symbols," Armitage finally declared, pushing his spectacles back with a trembling finger, "they defy any known human iconography. They are not Sumerian, nor Egyptian, nor even those enigmatic markings found in certain pre-dynastic Chinese bronzes. There are faint, disturbing echoes in certain of the more unorthodox anthropological texts, references to what are termed elder signs, or symbols associated with a chthonic worship predating Homo sapiens by unthinkable aeons. And the metal, you say it is gold, but of an unusual purity and weight?" Silas confirmed, recounting the bookseller's notes. Armitage merely shook his head, his gaze distant, haunted. "If these are genuine, if this metal truly bears these marks, then its origin is not merely ancient, Mr. Croft. Its origin is alien. It represents a form of currency from a civilization that existed before man crawled from the primordial ooze, perhaps even before life as we know it took hold on this planet. A truly cosmic anomaly. He then abruptly excused himself, citing an urgent engagement, leaving Silas in a disquieting silence filled with the musty odour of ancient parchment. The conversation with Armitage, instead of clarifying, had merely opened a deeper chasm of the unknown beneath Silas's feet. His investigation, initially a mundane pursuit of tax fraud, had begun to veer perilously close to the realm of the preternatural. The Whateley gold was not simply old money, it was impossibly old money. His next step was to trace the movement of these coins. The booksellers, unwilling to hold such peculiar coinage, had almost universally converted them into standard US dollars at various regional banks. Silas, utilizing his federal authority, began to subpoena their transaction records. This was where the true convolution began. The trail led from small-town banks in Massachusetts and Vermont to larger, more reputable institutions in Boston, and then, disturbingly, to the esteemed financial houses of New York. The gold coins, once deposited, were often converted into various instruments, cashier's checks, money orders, or directly into wire transfers. But the destinations of these funds were rarely straightforward. They were typically routed through a series of shell corporations, holding companies, and opaque trusts before vanishing into the general economic ether. What Silas did uncover, however, was a pattern. A significant portion of these funds, after their initial laundering, gravitated towards two distinct sectors. Firstly, specific university endowments, often earmarked for departments dealing with archaeology, obscure languages, and comparative mythology. And secondly, investment portfolios managed by several prominent old money banking families who, it was rumoured, had weathered the recent economic downturns with unnatural resilience. He began to notice that the seemingly legitimate financial institutions involved, the respectable Boston Trust, the venerable New England Mercantile Bank, even a colossal New York clearinghouse, displayed an unusual reticence when confronted with his inquiries. Junior clerks, usually eager to assist a federal auditor, became flustered and evasive. Mid-level managers offered vague explanations and referred him to superiors who were perpetually unavailable. The air in these immaculate offices, usually imbued with the crisp scent of new money and polished mahogany, began to feel subtly charged, as if an unspoken secret hung in the air, a silent, pervasive dread. One evening, while scrutinizing a particularly circuitous set of transactions that linked a Whateley payment to a research grant for Miskatonic University's ethnology department, Silas noticed a chilling detail. Interspersed among the legitimate bank codes and routing numbers were faint, almost imperceptible watermarks on some of the copies he'd obtained. These were not the usual security features. They were stylized, recurring patterns, faintly reminiscent of the symbols on the gold coins, but subtly distorted, like something seen through warped glass. His rational mind struggled to dismiss it as an optical illusion, a trick of the light or his own weary eyes. But the consistency of their appearance, always on documents related to the Whateley gold or its subsequent laundering, gnawed at him. It was as if an unseen hand had imprinted a sigil upon the very financial nervous system of the nation, a mark of ownership or origin. Silas began to experience unsettling dreams. Not nightmares of direct horror, but of vast cyclopean cities under alien suns, of monstrous shapes flitting through cosmic voids, and of an oppressive ancient intelligence whispering secrets in a language that twisted his very understanding of sanity. He would wake in a cold sweat, the Dunwich miasma seeming to cling to his sheets, the scent of primeval decay subtly permeating his Boston apartment. His meticulous order was beginning to fray at the edges, his once unassailable reason now assailed by an encroaching sense of the preternatural. The Whateley Trust, as he now privately referred to his investigation, was no longer merely a tax fraud case. It was an unfolding cryptogram, each new revelation hinting at a truth far more profound and terrifying than any financial irregularity. The gold, he realized with a growing, cold certainty, was not just currency. It was a conduit, a tangible link to something immensely old and malign, and its tendrils were reaching into the very heart of human civilization. The deeper Silas delved, the more the labyrinthine financial pathways revealed their true, unsettling design. The ancient gold coins, having passed through the hands of the Dunwich Whateleys and converted to fungible dollars, were not merely being spent. They were being channeled with surgical precision into the economic arteries of the nation. It became horrifyingly clear that major banks and venerable academic institutions were not merely unwitting recipients or indifferent intermediaries. They were active, albeit veiled, participants in a vast, unhallowed conspiracy. The major banks Silas had identified, the august institutions of Boston and New York, were using these laundered funds in sophisticated market manipulations. They weren't simply holding the money, they were investing it, leveraging it, creating vast pools of capital that seemed to defy the prevailing economic winds. While the first tremors of what would soon be called the Great Depression were already shaking the foundations of the global economy, these specific entities, buoyed by the influx of this impossible wealth, seemed unnaturally resilient. Their assets swelled, their reserves remained robust, and they made discreet, timely acquisitions of failing industries and undervalued stocks. The academic institutions, particularly Miskatonic University, were equally implicated. Beyond the research grants, Silas uncovered evidence of immense anonymous endowments. These endowments were always tied to specific, often esoteric departments: paleontology, ancient history, comparative eschatology. But the money wasn't just funding legitimate research. It was funding expeditions to remote, uninhabited corners of the globe, acquisitions of artifacts whose provenance was disturbingly vague, and the compilation of libraries of forbidden texts, grimoires and blasphemous treatises whispered about only in hushed academic circles. It appeared these institutions were not simply hoarding knowledge, they were actively seeking it, purchasing access to forgotten truths with the Whateley gold. Silas realized, with a lurch of sickening understanding, that the blood money from sorcerers was not merely a metaphorical turn of phrase. The immense ancient wealth was being poured into the financial system to generate an artificial stability for certain powerful factions, cushioning them from the impending collapse. But for what purpose? Why would an entity or entities capable of minting gold from pre-human epochs care about human economies? The answer began to crystallize, chilling him to his core. The Great Depression itself, the coming cataclysm of human despair and societal collapse, was not an accident. It was being engineered, or at least profoundly influenced, by this alien wealth, setting the stage for some unimaginable cosmic design. The blood was not just sacrificial offerings. It was the lifeblood of human civilization, slowly, insidiously drained and redirected. He sought an audience with Mr. Alistair Finch, the inscrutable, impeccably tailored vice president of the New England Mercantile Bank, one of the primary conduits for the laundered gold. Finch's office was a study in mahogany and muted power, a sanctuary of financial certainty. Yet when Silas presented his meticulously compiled evidence, the copies of the Whateley transactions, the peculiar symbols, the anomalous flow of capital, Finch's composure fractured ever so slightly. "Mr. Croft," Finch began, his voice low, almost a hiss, "you are treading on ground far more ancient and unstable than you can possibly comprehend. There are arrangements, understandings, forces that operate beyond the purview of your bureau, beyond the reach of human law. The gold you speak of, it is merely a token, a necessary lubricant in the machinery of far greater imperatives." Silas felt a prickle of cold fear. Imperatives? What imperatives could justify such a profound deception? Such a corruption of the very foundations of our society? Finch leaned forward, his eyes, usually cold and calculating, now gleamed with a disturbing, almost fanatical light. "Survival, Mr. Croft. The survival of certain knowledge, the safeguarding of certain access. The world is entering an era of upheaval. The economic collapse is merely a symptom of a deeper malady, a turning of the cosmic wheel. There are those who understand this, who see the cycles of aeons, not mere decades. And for that understanding, a price must be paid, a continuous generational offering." He paused, then added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "The Whateleys are but a single, crude faucet. There are many such conduits, Mr. Croft, many more ancient and far more potent. Their sorcery, as you so quaintly put it, is but the manipulation of forces you would deem impossible. And the gold, it ensures their continued operations, their sustenance, and their continued communion." Finch's gaze lingered on Silas, unsettlingly keen. "You would do well to forget what you have seen. The Bureau, in its finite wisdom, will find your theories unsupportable." The encounter left Silas shaken, his meticulously constructed world teetering on the brink of collapse. He was no longer just an auditor. He was an unwelcome voyeur into a conspiracy of cosmic proportions. The very air seemed to thicken around him, laden with unspoken truths, with the silent hum of ancient power. The watermarks on the documents, the peculiar symbols, the evasive eyes of the clerks, all coalesced into a hideous pattern, a blasphemous tapestry woven into the very fabric of global finance. The ultimate source of the gold remained elusive, yet Finch's words had provided a terrifying clarity. The Whateleys were merely agents. There was a greater, unseen power at play, using humanity's greed and its predictable cycles of boom and bust for an unknowable dread purpose. The Great Depression, once a purely economic catastrophe, now loomed as a monstrous, orchestrated ritual, funded by an impossible, malevolent currency. Driven by a desperate, if increasingly unhinged, need to understand, Silas found himself drawn back to Dunwich. The town, once merely a symbol of rural decay, now felt like the antechamber to an abyss. He bypassed the village, heading directly for Sentinel Hill, the Whateley homestead now looming in his mind as the nexus of this unholy exchange. The farm itself was a decrepit jumble of leaning barns and a squat, unpainted farmhouse, all emitting a distinct, cloying odour. a blend of stale farm animals, something vaguely sulphurous, and an indescribable sickly sweet perfume that seemed to cling to the very air. As he approached, a profound silence fell, broken only by the distant rhythmic chirping of an insect. Or was it an insect? The sound carried an unnatural pitch, a monotonous, insistent rhythm that seemed to bore into his very skull. He saw old Whateley, or rather a gaunt, stooped figure that might have been the elder Whateley, moving with an unnatural, shuffling gait across a pasture. The man was speaking not to an animal, but to the empty air. His words a series of guttural, non-human sounds that sent a primal shiver down Silas's spine. The cattle in the field, strangely, seemed healthier, fatter than any rational explanation could allow, their eyes reflecting a dull, bovine intelligence that, to Silas's now strained perception, seemed tinged with an inexplicable fear. Following a faint, barely discernible track through a dense, overgrown patch of woods behind the farmhouse, Silas discovered a crude, cyclopean stone structure. It was not a barn, nor a dwelling, but a circle of massive, unhewn stones, blackened with age and inscribed with symbols identical to those on the ancient gold coins. In the centre of the circle was a single flat slab, stained dark with what Silas's mind refused to acknowledge was blood. A low, persistent humming resonated from beneath the stone, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the very ground. He recognized, with a clarity that threatened to shatter his sanity, the implications of what he was seeing. This was not merely a ritual site, it was a conduit. The ancient gold was not mined, it was manifested. It was a byproduct, a waste product perhaps, or a deliberate offering from entities whose existence transcended all human understanding. The sorcerers were not merely individuals. They were the custodians, the attendants to a gate, through which flowed not just gold, but influence, power, and a subtle, insidious corruption. As he watched, a faint, translucent shimmering began to coalesce above the central slab. The air grew impossibly cold, then suffocatingly hot. The scent of ozone mingled with the nauseating, sickly sweetness. He heard a sound, a slithering, crushing sound, and a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of space. Then, through the shimmering, he glimpsed it. Not a definite shape, not a monster of flesh and blood, but a vast, indeterminate thing of shifting angles and impossible geometries, its surface a chaotic tapestry of colours that defied the spectrum. It was a fragment, a fleeting, nightmarish glimpse of something that defied 3 dimensions. A horror too profound, too alien for the human mind to process. A silent scream tore through Silas's throat, a soundless rupture of his sanity. He knew with an abyssal certainty that this was the source. This was where the gold originated, extruded from the unimaginable processes of a cosmic horror, a payment for some unholy pact, some ancient, terrible bargain. The Whateleys were merely the gatekeepers, the agents receiving the tokens of a power that saw humanity as nothing more than cattle to be bred, harvested, and led to slaughter. Their very economic well-being a manipulated feedlot for a grander, more terrifying design. The realization of the Great Depression's true genesis, not a market correction, but a cosmic manipulation, a harvesting of human despair and chaos to fuel some monstrous entity or agenda, shattered him. The gold flowing into the global economy was not merely wealth, it was a catalyst for suffering, a prelude to a greater, unhallowed feast. The banks and universities, the pillars of human civilization, were merely unwitting or complicit puppets, their institutions now tainted veins for the blood money of the cosmos. Silas Croft, the meticulous auditor, the rational man of ledgers and law, vanished. He did not literally disappear, not in the corporeal sense. His body returned to Boston, to his apartment, to his office. But the man within it was gone, replaced by a shell haunted by an unbearable knowledge. He tried, in a fevered, whispered conversation with a junior colleague, to explain what he had seen, what he had understood. His words were a torrent of archaic symbols, cosmic horrors, and financial conspiracies beyond the scope of any human agency. He spoke of the nine-angled star, of the cephalopodon motifs, of the impossible gold and the unseen entities that extruded it. He spoke of the Great Depression as a grand, orchestrated sacrifice. The colleague naturally reported him. Silas was found muttering incoherently in his office, sketching impossible geometries on financial reports, the lines of debit and credit twisted into blasphemous sigils. He was deemed suffering from an extreme nervous breakdown, a tragic casualty of overwork and stress. They institutionalized him quietly in a sanatorium outside Arkham, where the damp New England air carried a faint, persistent aroma of decay. He often spoke, in lucid moments, of the Whateley Trust, not as a legal entity, but as a vast cosmic conspiracy that underpinned the very fabric of existence. He saw the symbols everywhere, in the swirling patterns of dust motes, in the veins of the leaves outside his window, even in the intricate lace of the nurses' uniforms. The world, once ordered and rational, was now merely a thin veneer over an abyss of cosmic indifference and ancient malevolent power. The gold continued to flow, he knew, a silent, insidious poison in the veins of the world, preparing humanity for a future far more dreadful than any economic collapse could ever portend. And the universe, vast and uncaring, continued its slow, inexorable turning, deaf to the whispers of madness.